All right, here to help us break down everything that happened with the shooting in Oxford, Michigan, with the January 6th stuff. I'm a big fan of this guy. He is a former FBI assistant director, an NBC News contributor, and he's the host of his own podcast, The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi, and that's Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, Mike Leon, Nick Savari, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast, and I truly appreciate it.
Mike and Leon, thank you for having me. I enjoy casual conversations. That anything that's not 2 million people on live national television is nice for me.
That's right. Well, that's our goal one day, Frank. We're in the thousands. So
he's just being straight up. He's like, "You're not there yet.
Yeah.
Small potatoes. I'm going to relax to that." That's awesome.
Baby steps.
Exactly. Let's get into Nick and I are both parents, both girl dads to 4 girls collectively. What happened in Oxford, Michigan, and the suspect, Ethan Crumbley, that's now been arrested in connection with, the shooting of injuring 7 people, killing 4 people. He's in custody now. I would love to get not only your perspective on the case itself, but how does this work from a law enforcement perspective? Does the FBI work with local police supporting them on this? Would take us through the steps of the investigation process and what you think the Oxford Police Department is doing now to gather clues to help them in this investigation.
Well, I don't mean to be facetious, but you led the question by saying, "Tell us how this works with law enforcement," and I'll add, or does not work with law enforcement. So here's, I'm going to now get on a soapbox because I want to talk a little bit about how things should work in the school setting with partnership with law enforcement and the police, how they often don't work, and how we may not have learned any lessons, at least as it concerns this particular community. And then I'll go on to maybe FBI support of this. But as someone who's been an FBI leader for 25 years, I did host in my field offices law enforcement and combined law enforcement, and school official, guidance counselor, principal conferences. So they would sometimes, sadly, for the first time, meet with the police who were responsible for covering schools in their communities. And we walked through kind of an FBI model of warning signs and indicators, then when and how to bring in the police, and then how the police should assess a situation for potential violence. That model exists around the country, works very well, thankfully, in many, many communities. But we're hearing as this story unfolds that at least in this school, there were concerns, 2 separate teachers reportedly, eventually culminating in parents being brought in. And now we end up with dead children. So law enforcement seems not to have been brought in, at least early enough in this picture. We'll hear more as this unfolds. But if I do nothing else tonight, I'd like to just remind people that there are warning signs and indicators, both in kids and in adults, that you need to be attuned to. That you don't want to be the one who says after a tragedy, "I knew something was going to happen. My gut told me there was something wrong." Don't be that person. If you start hearing and seeing the language of despondency, "I can't take this anymore. There's nothing left to do. I've tried and exhausted all my avenues." And then start seeing acting out, ideation, verbalizing, "I'm going to hurt somebody. I'm going to hurt myself. If I just had a gun, I would do this. If I had the opportunity, I would hurt this person." And then some silence where the person now retreats into themselves because now they're ready to commit. They've done their training. They've written their disturbing essays. They've drawn their obsessive pictures. And now they're silent, get very, very worried about that period of time. You're approaching a flashpoint to violence there. We teach this to kids, teachers, counselors. Kids can recognize these signs as well. And certainly for police officer assessors. Where does the FBI come in something like Oxford? Well, no clear federal nexus here. Certainly the gun will be checked out by ATF. Where did this come from? We're hearing it was purchased within just days prior to the shooting, perhaps by the father. That's going to get looked at as, was that legal or not? And then the FBI will come in and offer us forensic services regarding computer forensics. Going through this kid's devices is going to be laborious, but it's going to be a treasure trove of insight into the path he took to violence. And my prediction will be, since the FBI has studied every one of these mass shootings, that there are going to be commonalities with the others, many of which I've talked to here. The isolation, the despair, despondency, the warning signs are going to have been there.
So if I'm a student, I feel like there's a bunch of places I want to go with what you just shared, and I appreciate you doing so, not just us as parents, but to our listeners too, Frank. But first, just stepping back, what's the FBI's relationship with mental health professionals? You were speaking about, interestingly, at the beginning, that for you and your growth becoming an FBI agent, it was more about accountants and like fields that we don't necessarily associate with law enforcement, which speaks to sort of a more broader understanding of what it takes to administer justice. But as it relates to mental health, what is the FBI's relationship, or how has that evolved over time in better understanding these trends as it relates to shooters or crime on a massive level like this?
Yeah, great question. Because if you had asked that maybe at the 30 years ago, the answer would have been different. There is now a dedicated unit within the behavioral science setting that does nothing but threat assessment. They are there not only to research and analyze tragic events and glean lessons from them and then disseminate the lessons nationally, but they're also engaged in real-time active assessment for law enforcement. So police departments know that they can go to the FBI office locally, and they can say, I need help on this one. This I don't know what to do with this kid or this adult. What say you, FBI threat assessors? And that'll go right back to Quantico, Virginia, where that unit exists, and they will provide some real-time assessment of what the behavior of this person is looking like in terms of assessing as a threat.
You mentioned some of the trends that you see. If you're a student at the high school, you mentioned there were at least 2 reportings of like people raising awareness of what was potentially happening. But if you're any student in school, what would you say to a student to immediately raise awareness? Like what are the appropriate channels to go through, and especially in the time of social media, where what you just described a moment ago is now being played out oftentimes through Facebook and all the other places too. But to the average student at that high school, or to any high school in America, or even as early as the middle schools, what would be a message you'd offer to students just to be vigilant about when they're seeing something that sort of falls into the pattern you described earlier?
Well, you raised the really important aspect of social media, and the reality that the best positioned people, the eyes and ears that are probably going to be the first to see a potential problem are the peers of that student. They are in those chat rooms. They're getting the direct messaging. They're looking at the Twitter or TikTok postings or Instagram. And they're the ones who know, because people start talking. Did you see that post? Did you see that tweet? Did you see that? And if we can train and equip them, they're the first ones to go, okay, I've heard about this before. I need to report. And then the school has to make it easy to report. Get over that hurdle that I'm ratting somebody out, or I could be wrong and this will be embarrassing, right? It's up to the school, the teachers, the counselors, leadership to say, we make this easy. There are redundant ways to do this. You can go to your teacher. You can go to the guidance counselor. You can walk into the assistant principal's office. Here's how we do it, and drill it and get it in their heads. It's sad, right, that we have to take time from math and history to talk about let's avoid getting killed in the hallway, right? But it's the reality today. So I would say to them, understand what the pathway to violence looks like. Understand when someone's acting atypical, talking about hurting themselves or others, the brooding, the obsessiveness, now talk of weapons, or when they start getting specific, I will stab them. I have my gun. I have the knife. You're getting closer and closer to the flashpoint. It's time to speak out and report.
There is a delineation about involvement in a case like this or any shooting. Because I imagine from like a federal level to like sort of local law enforcement, how does that relationship spark? Like in the midst, like when we have a shooting like this, does immediately the FBI receive, I mean, like they're obviously paying attention to the news like any other, organization in America, but what necessitates the FBI being able to appear? Is it sort of through the invitation of local law enforcement, or does something immediately come to the level of where this is something that federal intervention is acceptable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can tell you again, today the answer is different than many, many years ago, where the FBI would say to the police, hey, call us if you need us, right? Or even say, hey, that doesn't look federal to us. Very, very different posture here, largely because of 9/11. And after 9/11, the realization was that we need to presume that events like this could possibly be terrorism, as opposed to pre-9/11, where it was, again, call us, police department, if you see any evidence of terrorism, then we'll come and help. Today, any request you have, you need an evidence team to come in and do a complex crime scene? Do you need the SWAT team to come in because you've got a huge shopping mall that needs to be cleared and you can't do that alone? The answer is yes. You need psych services, victim witness services. The answer is we're here for you. It's a vastly different environment. There's no longer much concern in the immediate minutes after a tragedy like this. Hey, is this federal? Is this state? That has almost vanished. Of course, when charges are levied, yes, of course, then it matters. But in the aftermath, it's all hands on deck.